Of preaching here today, which is always a blessing and always a joy. So, I'm going to open the sermon as we continue in our story through Genesis. In our sermon series, Shalom, we're going to continue to look at what it means to experience God's peace in our world. And I'm going to open with an example of something that all of us are guilty of. Everybody does it, and I saw it a lot as a child of 6, as the oldest one. I saw this all the time. It seemed every time that a new child came along, everyone who met the new child or who had just seen them was like, oh my gosh, it looks just like your dad, or it just looks just like your mom, or it looks like your brother, and it's like, no, it doesn't. It looks like a sack of potatoes. It was only born 30 seconds ago. It doesn't, but we are all guilty of that. And I find myself, as people I know are having babies, I'm like, oh my gosh, it looks like the mom, looks like the dad, even though it looks like a boily little pot of clay at that point. And we're all guilty of that. And so that made me start to think, why do we need to tell the parents that their little tomato looks like them? You know, most people would be insulted if you compared them to a sack of potatoes, but hey, they like it in this case. And so I started to think about that and consider it. And often we find in our society that there's a need or a desire to compare the similarity of the child to the parent. So somehow we have to get credit to the creators of the little creatures, and we do that through recognizing their similarity. And so with that in mind, we're going to look at Genesis 1:26 and 27. And it says, "And then God said, 'Let us make man in our image.' Let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." So we find, if you want to justify your practice to yourself, that the first time a little sack of potatoes is compared to the Creator, it's in the Bible. So you're good. You can keep doing that. And so we find that after we see that this thing is created in God's image, it then begins, and Adam begins to spend its life, and every child that comes out of its parent is then going to spend however long it lives trying to figure out the answer to this question of why. Why do I exist? Why am I here? And we find that the beginning of this answer starts in the Garden of Eden. And we really need to focus in on what the Garden of Eden is and why it exists and what it means. Now, I'd like to point out that there's something interesting happening here. Because in every ancient civilization, every culture, kings on their palace, connected to their palace or their castle or their kingdom, would create a garden that was attached. And so that's why we end up with things like the Hanging Garden of Babylon, those type of things. Those were testaments to this king's power, especially in a culture where you live in an arid climate. To have a garden showed your power and your wealth. And we find that exactly happening here. So when we get to Eden, it's not the city of Eden, it's not the rock of Eden, it's not the town of Eden, it's not the tree of Eden. It's the Garden of Eden. And now it's important to notice, and something that Pastor Roland blew my mind with when he explained this to me, and I had never considered it, it's called the Garden of Eden. It is not Eden, it is the Garden of Eden. Meaning that Eden is something bigger and something larger, that the garden is attached to Eden somehow. So I can't tell you how many times I read the Genesis story and totally missed that fact, that Eden was not the garden. The garden was of Eden. So what it's establishing is that this is the garden of God's kingdom. So God has his Eden, and attached to it is the garden. It's the intersect between heaven and earth. And this is a very important thing, especially since we find out how incredible this garden is. And so God is kind of showing, if a king is measured by his garden, then God is not just a king, but he is the king. It's important because it testifies to the fact that God is ruling from his kingdom. And he has a seat in Eden and attached to it is the garden. And so that's very important. And then we come to the second point of God's creation of the earth, and another very important thing. And I'm going to introduce some new terminology to you, and I want you to think of this from now on, is the idea of a cosmic temple. And what that means is that God was constructing this earth and this universe as a cosmic temple for his dwelling place. And that seems kind of obvious. It seems, pretty simple, but there's a lot of depth when we start to dive down into it in what this means. So in every single ancient culture, when you walked into a temple, you found that there was a statue to whatever god or goddess ruled over that kingdom. So anytime you walked into an Egyptian temple, you'd see Horus, or anytime you walked into a Greek one, you'd see Zeus. And that's where we find some of the wonders of the ancient world, like the temple to Artemis, the temple to Zeus, those type of things, because these statues were important. If you go to the Parthenon in Greece, there used to be, it was like a 30-foot tall statue of Athena who stood at the center of the temple. And these statues were incredibly important to these ancient cultures. They worshiped them, but they didn't just worship them as representatives of the god. They were kind of had some of the power of the god. There's two huge things happening with every one of these statues. One is they were allowing the god to dwell in and among the temple. So the god could dwell in this statue. And I think back to my childhood when I watched the movie Hercules. It was a Disney movie, and Hercules walks in to the temple because he doesn't know who he is, and all of a sudden the statue becomes a living Zeus, and Zeus talks to him. And that's exactly what these people thought this was a similar situation to, that Zeus could step into this statue, that his power was that he was dwelling in it. And then the second important thing is they were considered to have some of the power of whatever god stood there. So the god was literally dwelling in the statue in some aspect, and they had their power. Now it's important to know that they never thought that this statue was the god. They thought that the statue represented the presence and had some of the presence of the god in it, but it wasn't actually the god. The god was completely other, but this was a way it interacted. So we end up with these two important points. Remember those, that they were allowing the god to dwell in the temple, and they were receiving the power of the god from the statue. So those two things are happening. So with that in mind, jump ahead to Genesis 2:19. I made the mistake of grabbing my Bible with the smallest text, and it's quite difficult to read. Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field, all of the birds of the air, and he brought them to man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave the names to all the livestock, all the birds of the air, and all the beasts of the field. So two huge things are happening. Suddenly, something different is occurring. So all the creatures have been made, but this is the first time someone other than God has named anything in the creation story at all. God is the only one with the power to name things, but all of a sudden, he's given some of that power to mankind. He's allowed mankind to participate in the creation story. And then in the New Testament, we eventually see Christ speaking of mankind as a dwelling place for God. Know ye not that you are a temple of the Lord? And so we see that those two things were occurring. So all of a sudden, mankind has become a dwelling place for God and has some of the power of God. They are participating in this story. And so when we begin to see this in light of a cosmic temple, all of a sudden we realize that God has created a temple out of our world. And instead of pillars, he's made mountains. Instead of fountains, he has rivers. Instead of frescoes on the ceiling, he's created the stars above him. And instead of a statue, he's placed mankind. Now that is critical to your understanding of the Genesis story. Suddenly, a living statue is the only statue capable of reflecting God. So when we get to Moses' time and Moses is writing that he received the 10 Commandments, do not try to make an image of me, that there is a reason behind it. It's because God has said, I've already created an image, and it is more wonderful than anything you can carve of stone, and you see it when you look in the mirror. That is the only image of me on this earth that I will permit to exist. And ultimately, that living statue attains perfection in Jesus Christ, but we've all been imbued with that responsibility and some of that power. God has allowed us to participate in that creation story. So everything around us is God's temple. We live in it and are meant to embrace it. This is the reality in which we live. See, so I remember last summer, a moment that shifted my worldview. Many of us have had those moments where all of a sudden something shifts in our lives and everything is not the same anymore. I had just watched a movie with my fiance, and I was walking out of the theater. And as we walked out, all of a sudden I look down at my phone and I see I have 6 missed calls and 4 text messages from my mother. I know something is up. And it was one of those moments where you felt it in the pit of your stomach. Something wasn't right. My mother never calls me 6 times in an hour and a half. And so I feel it in my stomach. I feel something is not right. I can feel the emotion behind it. And so I call her to find out what's going on. And instantly, as soon as she answers, I know something's not okay. And she says to me, she says, Andrew, your grandmother has had a heart attack. And I remember being in that movie theater and just coiling over in agony. All of a sudden, all these emotions were flooding through me, and I didn't know what to do. And I'm freaking out, and I'm panicking. I didn't feel like I was participating in a creation story at that moment. I did not feel like I was interacting with God. And so instantly, my first thought is, I need to go, I need to get home, I need to leave, I need to be out of here. And so I start rushing out of this theater, just wanting to leave. And my fiance stops me, and she's like, Andrew, you need to stop. We need to pray. And my first thought is, no, I need to go. I mean, totally like man brain thinking right there. What am I going to do if I've got to get home for 3 hours? What am I going to do? I can sit there and watch. That's about my contribution to the situation. And so she forces me to stop and pray. And I remember bending over again and just crying and sobbing and just being emotionally out of control. And in that moment, I did not feel like God was walking beside me. And, we often hear, if you pray about it, you feel better. But in that moment, I didn't feel better. That's the reality. But I had still invited God to participate in my story with me. And that makes all the difference. It's not about me feeling better, but me knowing that God is now walking with me. Because we took a moment to invite him into a situation. See, when we're in his temple, we have to realize that even though he's given us some of his power, he hasn't given it all to us. And there are going to be situations that are outside of our control. So we as humanity then need to participate in the story with him. See, the statues gain their power because the God granted them to them, not because the statue decided it wanted it. And so this really allows us to end up with 2 realities, and one of the 2 necessary consequences come out of God granting us the power to participate in his creation story. One is that we can totally derail our life and derail our story. We can run it off the rails easily. The second is the beauty that we can get it back on track with him. That we are capable of taking him into where we're going. And the beauty of the new creation. See, it says in the New Testament that we're a new creation in him. And that's a reality, and it takes on new meaning when we realize that we are still participating in a continuing creation story. See, Pastor Roland has been emphasizing to me as I read Genesis never to forget that the story doesn't end after day 7. That the story continues to move forward. Never forget that we're still in a creation story, in where we have the power to participate with God in something new and unique. See, the interesting thing about us as a culture and us as a society is that over the past 100 years, it's assumed that humanity has accumulated more knowledge and more advancement in technology than it has in the previous 10,000. We are always in a new creation story. Every situation you're in is unique. It's different. So it's not an ended story, it's an open-ended story. And so we continue to engage in that idea and that thought. And what does that mean when we bear his image today? And what is that reality of bearing his image today? His rest and his shalom and his peace is present in this moment, in who we are and where we're going. See, I remember I heard a story, and it's one of my all-time favorite stories, and it kind of changed the way that I looked at the way God walked with us. And I was sitting there as a young teenager. I think I was at a camp, or I was at a youth retreat, or I was doing something along those lines. And the pastor got up, and they told a story. And he talked about a man who was walking with God, and he had died, and he'd gone to heaven. And when he got there, he looked back over his life, and God said, "Look at the steps behind you. Those represent your life." And he looked down, and he was on a beach, and he could see all the steps in the sand stretching back. And he sees 2 sets of footprints. He's like, "Who's the second set?" And God said, "Oh, that's me. See that I never left you." And the man looks back, though, and he says, "Well, I can see that there's only 1 set of footprints. At some points, you left me, you abandoned me, you didn't carry, you didn't walk with me. I was alone." And God said, "No, don't you see? Those are the moments when I carried you." See, and the reality is that in the moment when I was doubled over in a movie theater, crying my eyes out, allowing a facial atrocity to exist that shouldn't. I don't look pretty when I cry. It's a mess. You kidding me? Do you see the size of my nose? When it's running, it's running. There I am, bawling my eyes out. It was in that moment, even though I didn't feel it, God was carrying me. And he was moving me forward in a story that I didn't understand, but that I was allowed to participate in. And that's the beauty of God's story in our lives. And so many of us face different situations where we don't feel like we're participating in a creation story. We feel like we are lost, we are confused, and there's no direction forward. I remember being in high school and being an atheist and not believing in God at all. And I remember the confusion, and the best way I can describe that moment in my life is just darkness. And it's weird to me because when I think back on those memories of walking that journey, walking that darkness where I didn't believe in a God, that they're almost tinted with a gray filter. All I can feel is that darkness still in those memories. And the reality is that I was lost. I wasn't taking a creation story. I was living in chaos. And one of the beauties that we have seen throughout this sermon series and through all the illustrations that Pastor Roland has given us is that God works in the chaos. God works in those moments of loss and confusion. And out of my confusion and my chaos that was my life came a much better, greater story than ever could have existed otherwise. If I were to put my story into this creation story, that was when I was formless, I was void, and I was an ocean. And God came in, and He tamed my ocean, tamed my darkness. He didn't eliminate it. I still have those memories. I still have that pain. But the reality is, it's now tamed, and it serves a purpose, and that is to testify to who Christ is and His power over chaos. The reality is, we are all participating in a creation story. We're all participating in moments, and every moment that we act in is a unique situation and a unique set of circumstance. And we have to choose to allow God to move in those seconds. See, God granted Adam the power to name the creatures of the earth. And similarly for us, He granted us the power to overcome the chaos of whatever we're going through. There is nothing that God cannot solve or that His love cannot overcome. See, this next week, I'm about to go to camp with all of the teenagers and all the youth from across our district. If any of you have ever been to a youth camp, it is total and complete chaos. It is a mess. Hundreds of teenagers, all doing their own thing. But out of that chaos will come God's glory and His greatness. See, the reality is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I've traveled from coast to coast. I've seen mountain ranges. I've seen monuments. I've seen oceans. But the most beautiful thing I have ever seen was 200 teenagers sitting, crying out for more, crying out for His glory and His testament. That is the most beautiful thing I could have imagined, because that was what was intended for our world. See, I've glimpsed the other side. I've seen a glimpse of heaven in the face of a teenager who cries that they are broken and they need God's glory. I've seen who He is. And in all of creation, in the mountains that are His pillars, in the rivers that are His fountain, in the stars that are His painting, the most beautiful creation was the statue He placed in His temple. We are that statue. We are that living statue, and there is nothing that can compare to what He has deemed as His dwelling place. He has cried out to His people, "You are my temple. I dwell in you. You have my power." See, and in just a moment, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come up and to seek prayer, to participate in the temple that is God's creation, to participate in prayer, to allow God to move in you, to allow God to take a moment to put His presence in your life. See, like the temples of old, God has chosen to dwell in the temple He created. He's chosen to dwell in you. And one of the hardest things I've had to learn in my short time as a pastor is that every conversation, every event, every Sunday, we are dealing with eternity. We're not dealing with this world, with short periods of time. We're dealing with eternity. And sometimes that can be overwhelming and seem like too much. But I have to remember, like a statue in a temple, I am not the God. I am merely a representative. And it's He who changes lives, not me. But we have an opportunity to participate in that. See, I don't know what that looks like for you. I don't know if it's dealing with your finances, dealing with your marriage, dealing with your family, dealing with your job. Where are the areas that you need a new creation to occur? Where are the areas that you say, you know what, I need to be a statue here. I need to represent you. And I need you to dwell in that part of your temple with me. I don't know what that looks like for you, because I'm not walking your journey. Your creation is unique and significant. But you know what that looks like. And you can take a moment to come up and say, I want you in this area, God. I need you in this moment of my life. I can't do it on my own. I'm only a statue, but I want to be your living statue. See, I remember growing up when the phone would ring, and sometimes I would answer, and it'd be my grandmother from Bennington, and I would say, hello? She would say, oh, hey, Michael. And I'd be saying, no, it's Andrew. And she would say to me, you sound just like your father. If there could be one testament of my life, I want it to be that. You sound just like your father. That's the statue I want to be. So if you'll bow your heads with me, Lord, allow us to be your living statues. Allow us to be testaments to who you are. Allow us to participate in the new creation story that you have for us. Allow us to have you living in our bodies, and in our souls, and in our minds. We cry out to you. In your name we pray. Amen. If you'll stand, we're going to go into a time of worship, and I would invite you to participate in God's creation.